I really appreciate it. And I had just maybe 9 or 10 questions I just wanted to try to get through as quickly as possible. And
before we jump into that, could I ask a little bit about yourself and kind of your context? Because
absolutely.
I'd just love to hear about how you kind of got interested in some of this stuff.
Oh, you bet. I've been a Christian my whole life. I think that, like everyone else, there was certain points where, you kind of question your faith as you get older. As you start, I studied biotechnology when I got to college, and probably like everyone else, there was certain things in those formative years where I started wondering, is this just superstition? Is there more to is Christianity all it's cut out to be? Or is it just, is this just a myth? And, but I wouldn't say I ever lost my faith, but I did read, I just by chance happened to find David Deutsch's book, Fabric of Reality.
Okay.
And the last few chapters of that book where he was going in depth discussing Frank Tipler's omega point theory, was what led me to. I went out and bought Physics of Immortality by Frank Tipler and Physics of Christianity, and that kind of really opened my eyes, and I was no longer at all skeptical about my Christian faith. And so that's just my background as far as as far as being interested in Christian transhumanism. And my first question almost kind of reflects that, like, how did you first become a Christian, and how did you become interested in science? So
I grew up as a preacher's kid, and so we were in churches all over the country, and a kind of smaller fellowship called the Churches of Christ, which most people would describe as a kind of very conservative, maybe fundamentalist group, and so that's what I grew up in, and I'm still part of. The thing I was taught was to study for myself, that I had to make my faith my own.
Right.
And because I took that seriously, I knew that meant not just studying the Bible as intently as I could, but also studying physics and science and philosophy and all these kinds of things, because I needed to truly make my faith my own. I needed to understand how all of this fit together, and I took it kind of as my responsibility as a Christian. Maybe I took things a little too seriously, more seriously than my Sunday school teachers maybe intended, but yeah, so that's how I ended up being a Christian from a young age. And then as I kind of entered into my young teen years, I started reading, like at age 12, I started reading all this atheist stuff, like Bertrand Russell's Why I'm Not a Christian, and Richard Dawkins, and all this kind of stuff. And and so it really challenged my faith, challenged my thinking. I never became an atheist, but I thought, maybe I will, because everybody who reads this stuff seems to.
Right.
And somewhere along the line, in wrestling with all that, I ran across Frank Tipler's work as well, and then I started running across the works of secular transhumanists, and started getting involved in those communities from the mid to late 90s, I guess, and I understood at that point that for me, this stuff was a fulfillment of my understanding of Christianity.
Right.
So that's how I got into this stuff.
Well, I think it's interesting that you mentioned Richard Dawkins there, because at least in the edition of Fabric of Reality by David Deutsch that I had stumbled upon, one of the things that was interesting is there was a big endorsement. There was a blurb from Richard Dawkins on that book, and so Richard Dawkins, to me, I had always viewed him as like one of the most preeminent, kind of one of the most respected from that school of skeptical atheism. And so for him to be endorsing this book, and then in the last half of the book, it was talking in a realistic and taking totally seriously the idea of resurrecting the dead. And so that was kind of blew me away as someone who was questioning my faith. And subsequent to that, we've seen Richard Dawkins. He's also endorsed the quantum archaeology theory, or he said that, you know, the quantum archaeology theory is something we should look into. That idea that, you know, that we could use biotechnology to resurrect dead humans. And 2,000 years ago, the Bible foretold that the sea would give up its dead and that humans would be physically resurrected in the far future. And so, do you believe that the Bible was accurately predicting the future? Do you believe that could be, you know, what he's discussing there could be exactly what the Bible was predicting?
Yeah, well, I think that what you read in the Old Testament is this struggling with the question of, like, how will things be made right? In the Old Testament, the belief is God made this world good. It got messed up, so that means it needs to be put right again. And
right.
So, how is it going to be put right? And, you know, people, you know, gradually the kind of prophetic vision of that's conveyed is like, oh, well, actually, to put everything right, we're going to have to bring back even the dead. That's ultimately going to have to bring back the dead in order to set things right. And that's a really profound place to get to, right? Where you say the only way we can fix everything is if we actually can bring back the dead. And then as you come into the New Testament, then not only is that emphasized, but then we have what appears to be a person who dies and does come back, right? Like, so that's the central story of the New Testament. And then the whole thing becomes, okay, this is starting to happen. We're going to see the resurrection of the dead. What is that going to look like? How is that going to play out? And you see in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul describes this as a process. He connects this to a lot of these prophecies. He understands it to be like, okay, it started with Jesus, and it's going to roll outward through others until actually death itself is entirely defeated. So this unfolding process of change. You know, how do you get the idea of progress? You get the idea of progress because God has begun to work in the world through people, and that's going to change things. And so, in the first several centuries, you see Christians saying, how are the dead going to come back? We believe that the dead are going to come back. How are they going to do it? And they start talking about the science of it. So Gregory of Nyssa in the 300s and his sister, they're talking about the science of how do you resurrect the dead. And so now we're talking about that today. And now it seems, from a certain angle, it seems scientifically plausible to us in a way that it didn't, you know, not that long ago. But it seemed scientifically plausible to Christians, you know, almost 2,000 years ago.
Right.
And it was never, they never understood it to be this separate thing. It was part of the process of how the world, the universe was going to be transformed and everything set to right. So yeah, I think it's the same vision from beginning of the kind of scriptural prophetic vision until now.
Right, and you talking about it being a process is interesting, because a lot of Christians think that it's going to be it's not going to be through human hands. It's not going to be through a scientific process. They think that it's just God's going to snap his fingers. But if you look in Isaiah 65:20, it talks about it being something that happens gradually, or something where it progressively human lifespan increases, because it says, as I just in Isaiah 65:20, it says, "Never again will there be an infant who lives but a few days, or an old man who does not live out his years. He who dies at 100 will be thought to be a mere youth. He who fails to reach 100 will be considered accursed." So it's talking about an imperfect process where people are still dying, but they're living way longer. And then later on we see, you know, where death is defeated completely here in the physical realm. So that is absolutely true, that the Bible seems to be describing an imperfect process instead of
Yeah, all through it, Jesus talks about a process. He talks about the mustard seed that grows into the largest of plants. He talks about the yeast that grows exponentially until it fills the whole loaf of bread. He draws on the book of Daniel, which has the stone that rolls down from the mountain, smashes the evil empires, and then grows and grows and grows to fill the whole earth. So there's all this this vision of like a process of something unfolding. And I think Jesus talks about that over and over. It's a process, it's unfolding. And Paul is just doing the same thing. He's saying this unfolding process is the process of restoring what God intended humanity to be like. So Christ is humanity as it was intended to be. And in Genesis 1, God gave humanity dominion over all creation. And Psalm 8 says the same thing, and Paul quotes Psalm 8 and says basically, this is human, the vision that God had for what humans were supposed to do. So Paul sees it as a participatory process that we're engaged in. It's Christ reigning through us to overcome death, not God just snapping his fingers.
Yeah. The right now there seems to be so much, and maybe it's been this way for a while, where Christianity and science seem to be at odds. You see it in the anti-vax movement. You see it in how much there seems to be so much contempt for the CDC and our different institutions, our scientists and doctors here in the United States, at least. Why do you think that is? That right now there's this so much contention between the scientific community and the religious community?
Yeah, well, I don't think it's a new thing. I think it's actually almost exactly 400 years old, but it's taken on a new kind of context now. But I think if you roll back to the beginning of the scientific revolution, in the 1600s, you have Francis Bacon, who I've described in various places as a Christian transhumanist. He understands that there's a Christian vision to use science and technology to extend life and do all kinds of things. He envisions like flying machines and virtual reality and what we would call genetic engineering and all this kind of stuff. And he writes the kind of manifesto that inspires all this scientific work. Well, he says, why haven't we done this before? Why hasn't it worked before? Well, it's because we haven't held together our search for knowledge with these particular ethical imperatives, the ethical demand to be humble ourselves, and the ethical demand to operate only out of love. And what happened is that this launched science as this really powerful endeavor, but over time, I think the religious folks started getting scared, and they said, "Wait a second! If we challenge everything, eventually this is going to come knocking on our door and start challenging our faith too," and we really don't want that to happen. And so, when you act out of fear, and you're afraid that science is going to knock over your doctrines or something like this, then you try to put up a wall. And I think this is what we've seen, where increasingly you'll see religious people try to say, okay, well, science can tell us these things, but it can't speak to this. It can't speak to God. It can't speak to spirituality. It can't speak to things that are in our domain, right? We don't want science telling us, for example, we don't want science telling us that God doesn't exist. So because we're afraid that it might say that, we then kind of put up a wall and say science can't say anything about this. And so Stephen Jay Gould, prominent evolutionary scientist, he described this as non-overlapping magisteria, the idea that these are just two different domains that could never speak to each other. And we've adopted that idea as a whole. This idea that science and faith or religion or spirituality are on two different worlds, essentially, and cannot speak to each other. And that is a recipe for disaster. Because as soon as you say these two parts of, from a Christian perspective, God's creation cannot speak to each other, then you've divided the world. And so people are going to pick up, at that point, you're going to have to pick sides, and you're going to have to pick increasingly small things to battle over. And you lose that initial, original, larger vision, the Christian vision, I would say, of how science and technology and ethics and values and spirituality can transform the entire cosmos.
Right. I mean, I think there is some truth to what you're saying. I think that Christians felt threatened because there was so many scientists that self-identified as atheists, and so Christians felt like it was encroaching on their worldview. And so I think that's exacerbated the problem to a great extent. But then on the other hand, there's so many areas. For instance, the man who first proposed the concept of the Big Bang was a Christian named Georges Lemaitre. I'm not sure how to pronounce it, but he was a Catholic priest, and his conception of the Big Bang is widely accepted by physicists and cosmologists, and that his conception is perfectly compatible with the Bible. In fact, it perhaps even validates the biblical account of creation. But it seems like Christians don't want to take credit when they're right. It seems like something like that comes along, and a lot of Christians I know don't believe in the Big Bang, and it's really perplexing to me, because to me it fits in perfectly with the biblical narrative of creation. So it is really mysterious to me. I will admit that there is many scientists who self-identify as atheists, but at the same time, if you look at Freeman Dyson was a self-professed Christian, Georges Lemaitre, Frank Tipler, Teilhard de Chardin. There's a great legacy, a great tradition of Christians in science. So I guess one of the other things I was going to ask you about was even about 15 or 20 years ago, people mocked people like Frank Tipler and characterized transhumanist theories as theology disguised as science. And when I first read Physics of Immortality, I wanted to run it past some of my, friends from college. And most of them, I found that they roundly dismissed it as pseudoscience. But fast forward, we have Elon Musk, the richest man in the world, asserting that we already live in a Tipler-style simulation. And similarly, Sam Harris has asserted that it's unthinkable that strong AI simulations will not come into existence. So that, to me, again, that's validating what Christians have been predicting all along. That's validating the idea that, that it's very possible that, as the Bible predicts, the sea will give up its dead. And so, do you think there will come a time when Christians, the Christian community, will start realizing that they were right and, take some credit for for predicting this when... because the science for thousands of years, scientists were saying no, there is not going to be a resurrection of the dead.
Right.
So, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So eventually, I mean, if I'm right, if my understanding is correct, then eventually, everybody will have to, right? Like eventually, Christianity as a whole will look at these things and say, oh yeah, like these things fit. The same kind of vision we've been talking about all along, and it like a lot of these things take a generation or two for people to adjust, and my hope is that we can speed up this process, because I think this is the problem. This idea that we have these two different worlds, science and religion, they're not going to communicate, and then religious people feel like that they have to keep, like they're being pressured to keep adjusting their understanding. Like okay, now we have our new scientific theory that says this is how organic life came about, and so now we've got to change our thinking. And so people are naturally resistant to that, right? They don't want to change their thinking, and I think we need to get a better understanding of our Christian tradition, our Christian heritage, where we say, wait a second, we shouldn't be the people who are like dragging our feet here. We should be on the other end of this, pulling this forward, because it's the Christian vision that we're actually looking to see unfold in these, scientific and technological ways. And yeah, I think, as we go on, we'll see increasingly things like you're talking about, like people, taking the simulation argument seriously, people seriously talking about plans to, terraform the cosmos, so to speak, seriously talking about plans to, bring back extinct species and then extinct civilizations and then extinct people, and finally, the resurrection of the dead. And all of those things will increasingly come under the purview of scientific investigation. And I hope that Christians are helping to lead that charge rather than grudgingly accept it. But we'll have to wait and see, and I guess trust that the Holy Spirit is working through people and get them to kind of hopefully getting them to gradually move in the right direction here. So yeah.
Right. Well, one of the things that's interesting to me as a lifelong Christian is that so many things that were unclear about the Bible suddenly do come into focus when you view it through the lens of transhumanism, because there, and as it says in the Bible, we see now, I can't remember the exact passage, but we see darkly as through a
through a mirror.
Right, and so
and we shall see face to face. Yeah.
Exactly, and so it seems like a lot of things that didn't make sense are through that paradigm. Seeing it through the transhumanist perspective, it does start to make more sense. And one of the things especially is how in the Bible it talks about resurrections, and why is the resurrection happening presumably thousands of years in the future. In Corinthians 15:51 it says, "Listen, I tell you a mystery, we will not all sleep, but we will be changed in the flash, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last trumpet, for the trumpet will sound, the dead will be raised imperishable, and we will be changed." And so there are countless other Bible verses which suggest that the sleeping and the long departed will be raised up in the far future, and that it will be a physical resurrection here in the physical universe. And so so much of that falls into place when you think of it. Okay, well, this could be exactly what Frank Tipler's talking about when he says literally at the very last day, at the very end of the universe, there'll be this universal simulation where everyone will be brought back. So things like that all start to fall into place. The other thing that's been interesting to me about looking at transhumanism is that all the arguments that people make against transhumanism, I can refute those arguments by what I've learned from being a Christian. Like some people like Elon Musk have warned about the potential dangers of AI, although he's kind of changed it seems like he's kind of changed his position on that recently. But he once said AI he compared it to possibly summoning a demon.
Right, yeah.
But many people have warned that if virtual heavens are possible, so are virtual hells. But I think that maybe that's what the Bible is warning about when it talks about hell. The book of Revelations talks about a new heaven and a new earth, but it also talks about the new hell, a lake of fire.
Yeah.
And what I've wondered about is, what if Revelations is talking about two different possible futures? What if the Bible is warning about the dangers of evil and different possible futures? What if the Bible is warning about the danger of evil people being in charge of simulated reality? There are only two reasons I can think of that would lead people to creating virtual hells, and basically it would be like revenge or basically sins that are listed in the Bible that are listed in the Bible as things that could lead to hell. And so maybe when John says the ultimate state of the universe is a new heaven and a new earth where everyone is redeemed, where for instance, every knee shall bow and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, as it says in Philippians, maybe that is St. Paul describing the most likely outcome, and that's what we as humans should be working towards. But then there's also this warning about hell and the acknowledgement of what people like Elon and others have noted, that virtual hells could also potentially be rendered. What do you think of that theory, that's more of a warning than an actual? Because I've always struggled with the concept of hell, and I know a lot of other Christians. That's one of the reason they fell away from their faith is this idea of hell doesn't seem compatible with the idea of a loving God.
Right. Yeah, I think you're right in that I don't think it's coherent to take like the Dantean view of hell, where God's just torturing people forever. So there are other options that people look at, and one of them is, annihilationism and so forth. But in the context of, and then universalism and so on. But in the context of talking about this kind of, transhumanism and the future, I think you're right that there is it kind of opens up a profound perspective, because once we start thinking about the science and technology that we are going to have access to in the future, well, it's very clear that we can either use that technology to destroy each other and ourselves, or we can use it to uplift each other and ourselves, right? It's two paths. And so Jesus loves to talk about, the two paths, the narrow way or the broad way that leads to the destruction. You're always faced with those kind of two choices, because, when you have immense scientific and technological power, you can use it for destruction. It will be used for destruction. And a lot of the stories we see in the scripture are about how people use their power to bring down destruction on themselves. It's not just that they're destroying each other, it's that attempt to destroy others actually backfires. It actually destroys them. And so I think that's the ultimate kind of lesson of hell. If you choose to use power for evil, it's going to backfire, and it's going to trap you in the fallout. I think Scripture says that over and over and over in lots of different ways. And so, as we build simulated worlds, as we spread out into the universe, as we tackle all kinds of new technological powers, are we using them for evil or are we using them for good? If we are using them for evil, then and that goes unchecked, unstopped, then we will ultimately trap ourselves in a hell of our own making. C.S. Lewis says, the door to hell is locked from the inside. And right. That's the kind of scenario I think we do face. And on the other hand, if we choose to forgive, use compassion, cooperation, trust, all these kinds of things that Jesus and the early Christians talk about, then those can go to create heaven on earth and heaven spreading out into the cosmos. And I think what's great about the book of Revelation is it leaves this question in many ways remarkably open-ended. If you look at the last kind of page, it's that here's the new Jerusalem descending into the universe, descending into the world, and light and goodness is streaming out of it. People are streaming into it and out of it. It is filled with humans and ecology and technology and all this kind of stuff. Everything that's good in the world is being brought into it. But outside, there are still people choosing bad things. And so it kind of leaves it out as a question mark. Which will we choose? Will we choose to follow the path towards this bright, amazing future, or will we choose to reject that, turn to the darkness, and stay outside? And how that winds up, kind of the end of that story is kind of left to us to write in some ways.
Right. Well, I think I was talking to kind of a theologically minded friend of mine about this very topic, because I think everyone struggles with the concept of hell. But what I was pointing out was that hell is discussed in the present tense in the Bible, as in people are currently in hell in different passages in the Bible. But that all seems to end with the harrowing of hell when Christ descends down at his death. In Peter 3:18-20 it says, "For Christ suffered once for sins, He was put to death in the body, but made alive in the spirit. After being made alive, he went and made proclamation to the imprisoned spirits to those who were disobedient long ago, when God waited patiently in the days of Noah. And so it very clearly describes in the Bible where Christ goes and frees everyone in hell. And as far as I can tell, every mention of hell after that is referring to it's the Revelation. It's the very apocalyptic imagery in Revelations, where it's discussing this possible lake of fire in the future. But again, the way I read it is that it could be discussing an alternate future. It could be there's one possible future where every knee shall bow and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, and that the alternate future to that is that society goes down the wrong road. I don't think there's any possibility that that would happen. I think that being the future is extremely, extremely unlikely, because there's too many checks and balances that would prevent that from ever happening. But I think there's that paradoxical thing where you have to be warned about something to make sure that it doesn't happen. And even though I think the Christian victory is assured that everyone will eventually come to Christ, there has to be that warning of the potential dangers if we don't follow the right path, and if we do allow sin to take us down the wrong path.
You mentioned the harrowing of hell. That's powerful focus in branches of Christianity like Eastern Orthodoxy.
Right.
A huge focus on it there. That and I think all Christians should be thinking along those lines. That Christ is the one who destroys the darkness, destroys that which imprisons us. Right. The victory of Christ is what we're talking about, looking forward to and working towards. And even if we find ourselves in short-term, building short-term hells, then I think we can say those will fall, and those hells will be emptied out, and that's part of what we look at as the power of God.
Right, because you'll often hear references, people like Jack Chick and others who are kind of more to the hellfire and brimstone, will often reference the Lazarus story of Lazarus and the rich man, but not many Christians will point out that the rich man was actually freed from hell, because the harrowing of hell took place after that story. And so it's interesting that I don't feel that hell is compatible with the narrative of a loving God, but because of the fact that things in the Bible don't necessarily make sense right away, and we're warned about that up front, that eventually it will become more clear as we learn more. And I think this is another case of that. I wanted to talk about Calvinism really fast, if that's okay. I was not a fan of Calvinism as a youth, because that goes right hand in hand with this idea of hell, that if God is predestining people to go to hell, that is a very bleak outlook. I mean, it's definitely hard to reconcile that with the concept of a loving God. And so this was something as a kid I was like, this doesn't add up. But there's definitely passages in the Bible that do seem to that does grant some credence to Calvinists, some of his viewpoints. Just before I ask my actual question, what are your views on Calvinism in general?
Well, so the church I grew up in was not a Calvinist church, so the kind of divide between like Calvinism and Arminianism, I guess we would be on the other side of it. That said, there's plenty of Calvinists in the Christian Transhumanist Association, and and I think what you're getting at is that question of determinism. Like, are we predetermined to some end or something like that? And so, I totally see. Like, it's a tough question, but I think that transhumanism kind of gives us some interesting possibilities for that.
One of the things that was really fascinating to me about Calvinism was when I started really thinking really carefully about the implications of Frank Tipler's, and well, I don't know if I should call it Frank Tipler's, but simulation theory in general. The idea that everyone could be potentially brought back as simulations. And virtual timelines can be limited to timelines where we have a reasonable approximation to the initial historical timelines. But the problem is that even when we follow the initial historical timelines, there are still sequences of time which will remain uncertain and kind of shrouded in mystery. And so, which is why we'll have to have multiple alternate simulations to cover every potential branch in our recapitulated history. And Tipler goes into this in depth, where he talks about how we'll have to have trillions of simulations if we actually want to recapture our memories, because obviously we don't. As he points out, human beings are more than just the genetics, or more than just the biological makeup. It's all the memories and the experiences is what really makes a person.
Right.
So to bring back the full person, we do have to, recapture everyone's the memories and experiences, the relationships that they built in their lives. So one of the things that was interesting that I thought about was that Calvinism is almost required for this, because if there's a timeline where so if a person gets murdered in a specific timeline, no one definitively knows who murdered that person. Let me phrase it a different way. If there's an unsolved murder, if there's a murder where the person who committed the crime is not definitively known, then that becomes problematic in a recapitulation timeline, because the humans who resurrect us will have to run multiple simulations, and some of those simulations they will have they'll have hundreds, if not thousands, of different people who will have to be cast in the role of the murderer, because there will be all these they won't know exactly who was the actual murderer, and in many of those simulations it will be there will be hundreds of thousands of options, because reasonable certainty and reasonable doubt as defined by judicial law cannot be considered the standard, because if it was even remotely possible for any human to have murdered her, the simulated timeline has to branch out to accommodate that possibility. And so if you follow the implications of this to its natural conclusion, this will lead to trillions of timelines where innocent people are implicated in murders. And when all unsolved murders are brought into consideration, it will follow that nearly every single person who lives or who has ever lived will be implicated in multiple murders. And so when I started thinking about this and how disturbing this concept is, it automatically brought to mind John Calvin's concept of total depravity, or even just the broader Judeo-Christian concept of original sin, the idea that all humans are guilty even before they've done anything wrong. And that doesn't seem fair, and it probably seems disturbing to the average person on the street that there could be that in the simulated timelines there could be timelines where they're considered guilty. But the thing is that being implicated in a murder that's exactly what the concept of original sin or total depravity seems to be saying, is that, I'm sorry, because of the fallen state of man, you're all guilty of everything. And so this would be one of the byproducts of having to run a universal simulation. And I wish it wasn't that way, but it seems like Christianity is preparing us for that concept. Because I know a lot of people will say, I don't want there to be a timeline or a simulated timeline where I'm considered a murderer. But again, my Christian faith has given me a built-in response, because according to the concept of original sin, everyone's already guilty of murder. According to 2,000 years of Christian tradition, you were born guilty. But on the other hand, every guilty person can also be redeemed and made white as snow, as it says in Isaiah. And so I don't know. That's something I thought about. And then there was so much more to Calvinism's insistence that everything is pre-programmed, because if you are going to run these simulated timelines, you're forcing people into these situations. You're forcing them to do these things that are integral to keeping the timelines, to making sure that the timelines do run through every possible variation. And so that also seems to me exactly what predestination, what we're taught, the concept of predestination, that people God even predestined some people to murder, some people to commit crimes. And so there's a very interesting analogy there. Does that make sense to you? Does that seem to you like there is some kind of an overlap there between the Calvinist doctrine and simulation theory?
Yeah, that's a really interesting way of thinking you put together right there, and it does, I think, merit like thinking about how we relate to all these like kind of divergent histories and timelines. Well, simulations are going to be made with different things playing out, right? Sometimes it brings up all kinds of questions, like the things that we're less certain of right now, like I'm not sure whether I brought that cup upstairs or left it downstairs. Well, from the point of view of like the God's eye point of view, there's a simulated reality where it went one way or went the other way.
Right.
Maybe the fact that I don't know actually indicates like that it didn't matter, right? So maybe those two different small things cancel themselves out. But you're also you're bringing up the idea of this kind of this kind of like all or nothing guilt, and there is something to that, right? And we know that even without looking at simulations. We know that because there's a recent movie out, Don't Look Up, and there's a comet hurtling towards Earth, and it's going to destroy Earth. And so you say, well, all these people are going to die, effectively be murdered if we don't, get our act together and divert this comet,
Right.
And so if, you look at that and you say, okay, in that kind of scenario, if they divert the comet, all these lives are saved. If they fail to divert the comet, who's to blame? Well, in some ways, like, everybody's to blame, right? Like,
right.
We all failed to get together and cooperate and do this. And I think there's something about that is recognized in the biblical account and is recognized in the Christian faith. Why aren't we able to solve more diseases right now? Why aren't we able to prevent pandemics? Why aren't we able to cure cancer? In some ways it's because, well, we didn't put enough effort into advancing certain science and certain technology and things like this. Well, why not? Well, somebody didn't prioritize that.
Right.
Didn't prioritize it enough, and didn't work on it. Maybe we've only been working on that kind of stuff for 50 years instead of the last 500 years. Well, why? From a certain perspective, you would say, well, it's ultimately sinfulness. It's ultimately like that people were shirking their God-given beauty to pursue science and pursue understanding God's creation and how to use it. And so there is a kind of collective guilt, in a sense, of like, we didn't prevent these things because we didn't invest the time and effort in preventing them that we should have. We didn't take it on ourselves to do that. We failed, in some sense, our moral responsibility. And who's going to suffer for it? Well, we all are.
Right.
And we all, have failed to advance that, in some of the ways we could have, right? So Paul will say, we've all sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, right? It's not so much just that we are all guilty of potential crimes. It's also that we could have done so much better, all of us, and we failed to do so, and that means certain things will happen that didn't have to happen. So yeah, I think there is this sense of yeah, and in a sense, it's not individual. It's like on us all, and it's not exactly, our fault. But we're going to have to deal with it. And yeah, I think thinking about original sin and determinism and so forth are good kind of ways to grapple with those realities of how the world actually works.
Yeah, I think you make a good point about. I think looking back, as I understand more about the Bible and as I understand more about science, it seems to me that so much of what the Bible is talking about is relating to mankind on a societal level, much more than on a personal level. It is relating on a personal level, but so much of it, like there is references to hell in the Olivet Discourse, but Christ is clearly talking about the destruction of Israel. He's clearly talking about societal level events. And people often try to smash that together with the general doctrine of hell. And again, I think the stuff in Revelations is also on a societal level. When it talks about the lake of fire, when it's talking about a societal level warning about, I think it's possible, it's talking about the dangers of simulated reality in the wrong hands. And so, conversely, when it's talking about new heaven and new earth, it's talking about societal level events that will affect everyone. It's, if we have a new heaven and a new earth, everyone will be in the new heaven and new earth. I'm a universalist in that sense. I think that, but I think, it's very interesting. I think one of the problems that the modern Christian church is facing is that I do think that I kind of go back and forth between thinking they are nervous about this. They think that the consensus, the general consensus among scientists, contradicts their worldview. But I also think that the other side of that is that with the new wave of like conspiracy theories and the suspicion of institutions, the suspicion of everything from the FBI to the CIA to the CDC, Christians have for some reason lost trust in our institutions. And I think that even extends to the Bible in a sense. I think that they are not sure where they even stand on the Bible, which is why I think we're seeing a wave of kind of New Age Christianity. You see that in the QAnon movement. You see like where they kind of mash together their Christian faith with New Age beliefs. I mean, they even have a QAnon shaman. That says a lot right there. And that goes hand in hand with like the Coast to Coast AM Alex Jones culture, where it's kind of a strange mixture of Christianity with UFOs and a lot of New Age mumbo jumbo. So I think we've gotten away from people viewing the Bible as, inerrant truth. And I think it's people just kind of thinking, I'm going to put together my own belief system.
Right.
It kind of goes along with that general distrust of institutions. So along with people throwing out the CIA, the FBI, and the CDC, they're also throwing out traditional Christian beliefs. And I don't know. That's kind of one thing I like. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think you're right that we live in a time of growing distrust of institutions, and it's kind of ironic in some ways that this is happening among like evangelical Christian communities. But yeah, that is an interesting thing because I think we are both called to build institutions as Christians and also to sustain institutions. And
right.
I find this in Paul's writings. They're living in a world with terrible institutions.
Right.
The gladiator games and all this kind of stuff. The ways that Christians are persecuted in the Roman Empire, and yet Paul wants to say it's still being able to have a society that is still important, even if we're on the wrong side of that institution, at the moment, right? And so it's interesting how that shifts to now now in Christian communities we're distrusting every institution, we're distrusting every process that's not our own what, like you said, what we put together in our own heads. And yeah, that's going to, at the end of the day, that's going to extend to the scripture, it's going to extend to church, it's going to extend to everything else. It's just going to be whatever you think. And that's where you get flat earth stuff and all this kind of stuff. It's this radical skepticism of anything that's not me, that's not my own intelligence coming up with it. And yeah, I think at the end of the day, those are our choices. Are we going to be radical skeptics and distrust science and society and institutions and every bit of that, or are we going to actually, kind of, as the scriptures say, lean not on our own understanding and actually search for scientific processes and work towards a transhumanist future?
Right. I mean, you have multiple references in the Bible where it talks about lean not on your understanding, and I can't remember the passage in Proverbs, but a wise man seeks a multiple of counsels. It's funny. It almost feels like a recapitulation of the 60s hippie movement, what's happening in the Christian church, because back then you had that distrust of the government, of the CIA and of the FBI, and you justified it with conspiracy theories, and it just seems so odd that it would be that kind of culture would be coming back on the right wing of all places. But I do think it's and it is good to have a healthy skepticism. I'm definitely 10 years ago I would have said I was very distrustful of big government. I would have said that I was a small government conservative. I still am. But the point is that humans created these institutions for a reason. I mean, we created the police and we created the FBI. We created these things because the police department, for all its faults, is still better than a lynch mob. And if people will take a step back and remember why we created these institutions, I think it would do a lot of good. But I mean, it's just completely veered into the absurd when you have people thinking that Alex Jones knows more than hundreds of thousands of scientists and doctors. I mean, that's where it becomes problematic. Right, and that something's broken within the Christian community.
Yeah, well, and you get Bible passages that talk about this kind of scenario too. The things that your itching ears want to hear, right? Like you want to hear certain kinds of you want to hear your guy get on there and say something that sounds right to you, and so that you're going to listen to it, whoever it is. And it's dangerous and it's destructive, but it's certainly not a new thing. It's unfortunate that it's so deeply intertwined with the American Christian community at this point in time.
Right, and hopefully it's just a phase. Well, Micah, I really appreciate it. I'll just give you one more question because I think we've been going about an hour here. I'll kind of wrap things up here. The supernatural, because we've talked a lot about how Christianity can be explained through the physical world, how the different prophecies and predictions in the Bible have played out in a physical way. But do you believe, as a Christian transhumanist, do you believe there is a supernatural component to reality? Because some of the most fundamental aspects of our lives have a basis in the supernatural. For example, love is a religious, supernatural concept that cannot be explained from a strict scientific worldview. We know it's that there's a genetic imperative for humans to reproduce and to have children. And so when you deconstruct the idea of what we call love, there's really nothing there. If you just keep pulling the string, it unravels something that our whole lives are built around. But do you feel that there is, because I as a Christian, I do feel there's a supernatural component, but I just kind of wanted to see what your perspective was on that.
Yeah, so it just comes down to what we how we use the word supernatural, really. And so sometimes people use it to mean it's something we can't look at, something we can't question or can't interrogate. And so in that sense, I would say there is nothing in God's creation that we can't interrogate, right? So we've been talking about with a resurrection. So is that something beyond our what we're allowed to look into? I would say no. I would say from a scriptural perspective, no. We're actually called to look into it and figure out how it's supposed to work. So the way some people use the word supernatural, then I would say, it's all within the purview of God's creation, and it's all within our purview as children of God to look at it. But there is, as you're pointing out, there is this the fact that things are not reductive. They don't just it's not just that everything boils down to particles. There's other things going on here, including obviously like consciousness, which we don't yet understand. Including abstract things like values, including things like love and so forth, like you're talking about. All these kinds of things, and many, many, many more, are going on in the universe, and we are only even slightly aware of some of them. I'm trying to think of some good examples, but
well, I think, you've cited a couple of good examples. I think emergence is something that needs, obviously this is one of the great mysteries of the universe, is why and love is one of the best examples of that. How something that's more than the sum of its parts can be the most important thing for the human race. And love, holds everything together, but it doesn't make sense if you start looking at it from a scientific perspective. It just there's nothing really there. It's
like you're saying, more than the sum of the parts, and that's the key. And also from a practical perspective, I think this is important for transhumanists, and particularly for Christian transhumanists. We are called to do these things. We are called to participate in these processes, the process of overcoming death, of extending life, of defeating illness, and all these kinds of things. That doesn't mean it's just our effort, right? What is actually going to happen, I think, and what I think we see, is when we actually go and engage these processes, as Scripture calls the good works that were prepared for us to do, then what happens unfolds better and faster than we anticipated or could have accounted for. Because I think that we are ultimately met with power that is greater than us, and that we can never fully account for in our in kind of our expectations, right? And so you have to have faith. You have to step out on faith, and whatever it is, if you're going to build a spaceship, or you're going to pioneer electricity, or you're going to try to solve a crazy math problem, or whatever it is, you have to step out on faith, and then pray and trust that whatever resources you don't yet have will actually show up and help the process be completed. Have that kind of trust in that. So right. Yeah, the idea that it's not just us, it's not just we need to do the effort, but it's not that we're trusting and hoping that we will be met with greater providence, is the old-fashioned word, providence, that is more than what we currently know or understand.
Right, and that concept of faith has been so key. If you think about it, there's no reason the human race. I agree completely with Tolstoy and Nietzsche when they basically argued, Tolstoy especially, arguing that it made no sense for humans to even continue. If you have the nihilistic worldview, there's no reason you would have kids. Obviously, a lot of those guys didn't. Nietzsche never had kids. Many of those philosophers who viewed the world as pointless saw no reason in perpetuating the human race. It was only because Christians had faith that we kept thinking, there is a reason to keep going with even though it seems absurd. Thank God our ancestors did have faith, and they did kept the human race going, and now thousands of years later, we see that everything the Christians believed, the reasons they thought it was important to keep pressing forward, now we see it is coming into fruition. We see that a lot of the promises of Scripture are being fulfilled. They were right. Ultimately, they were right about everything. now, ironically, I think they've kind of lost the plot in certain areas. But yeah, I think it's interesting. It unfolds in basically in the same way that the Bible always said it would unfold. And if you look at like Teilhard de Chardin, talking about emergence, Teilhard de Chardin has, I don't know if I agree with him completely, but he has some really interesting things to write about that. David Bohm's implicate order theory. You can see there's hard scientists that have made the case for, how meaning is, even if the world was initially meaningless, we are evolving, and the world is getting, we are creating our own meaning, if nothing else. And it was because Christians, it was a self-fulfilling prophecy. They believed that life had meaning, and now, thousands of years later, whether we created it or whether that meaning was implicit all along, we're seeing that the Bible was right. Well, anyways, I really appreciate your time, Micah. It's been a little over an hour here, so I probably should let you go. But if you have, actually, let me do one closing statement though. Is there anything that you would like to really quickly let people know about, anything that you're working on, or any projects you'd like people to check out?
Yeah, well, just for right now, I would say just check out the Christian Transhumanist Association. There's lots of people with lots of different takes on this stuff and different ways of kind of understanding things and different focuses. And I think it's really helpful to get that perspective. And so ChristianTranshumanism.org is the website. There's a pretty active Facebook group, and that's where a lot of stuff happens. And we're also on various other forms of social media. But I would say look into that and get involved if you're interested.